welcome to Property Matters here on Dublin South FM. You can contact the show on Twitter, Facebook or LinkedIn at iPropertyRadio, or indeed email the show at hello@iPropertyRadio.com. First up today, I'm joined by show regular Vincent Harney, CEO of Anasorian. Vincent, you're very welcome back.
Good morning to you, Carol. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Vince, the last time we spoke, we were talking about the revaluation of properties post-COVID. And I think even when we were having that conversation, we knew it was quite premature to be having that conversation. 6 months on, where are we in terms of, obviously the pandemic is not over, but we're certainly hope that we're coming out the latter end of it. Where do we stand in terms of real estate?
I think there's quite a large gulf still in terms of what we think we know and what's actually happening. So, for example, I think offices are we're just only starting to see people go back to work, and certainly from the investors I deal with, the appetite for investing full time into offices is certainly taking a bit of a backseat. They might do it once there's a bit more stability, and that's certainly affecting the valuations, because the way that a lot of these investors are looking at it, they're looking at a long-term gig on the offices, and what, from their perspective, they're a bit nervous at the moment because everybody's talking about it, but not many people are doing it in terms of that full return to normality. So that's affecting the type of product they're investing in. It might be quite interesting to know, Carol, I did a recent CPD on this aspect, and we were talking about a European angle where the guys, the investors, were actually looking to invest in stuff that you and me wouldn't think about. There's things that are top of the charts, are things like data centers, and virtually anything to do with residential accommodation is in the top 10. So there's a lot of refocusing of investment monies from commercial into more residential, which you and I would both know 10 years ago would be virtually unheard of. That amount of money that they're sloshing around into residential.
Yeah, there's been so many interesting trends that I definitely want to unpack some of them. In terms of data centers, that actually doesn't surprise me at all. We've seen this move towards logistics, and data has grown as an asset class of its own. But also we're seeing, if anything, the last 2 years has magnified the need and the importance of data centers. But yet, I know we're talking about a European perspective here, but in Ireland, data centers are getting quite a bad rap. And in terms of our planning, particularly in the Leinster area. So, I mean, do you have a perspective to offer on that? I mean, are we starting to villainize data centers the same way we did certain residential classes like build to rent, in a way that will be ultimately destructive for our market?
Potentially, because at the end of the day, we're not Germany in a way. Germany's got like 60 plus million people on board. We've got 6 million. So there has to be a sort of economy of scale on that, but that doesn't mean that you're not dealing with data centers on an international basis, Carol. So they could be based in Ireland for very lucrative and tax reasons, rather than the pragmatism or the demographics of what they're dealing with. So there's a whole load of different factors you have to build in when looking at data centers. But I agree with you. There could be a potential disruptive effect of having those in the marketplace.
Yeah, it seems to me that when the general public are rallied, usually by the tone of media reporting against any asset class, we always find some really big misconceptions at the center of that, always. And and that's one of the things around data centers. But rather than kind of going too far into that, I would urge anybody who has an interest in this maybe to take a look at the work that Host in Ireland are doing. So that's a body that is committed to putting out information, truthful and factual, real-time information about the data center sector in Ireland. And it dispels some of the myths in terms of not just energy usage, but actually energy creation as well. Putting forward the the full story around energy creation and how these data centres are actually bringing in some really important innovations to Ireland to capture some of the unused or underused resources that we have, you know, including wind energy and things like that. So that's, I think that's a really hot topic. So I would urge anybody who has an interest in it to go look up Host in Ireland and see the work that that organisation is doing. Some really interesting things. And when you get down to the facts, you'll realise that actually an awful lot of what we're reading in the media is just not accurate, and it's just not, you know, it's based on some very outdated concepts that have since been disproven. And you know, that almost links us back to maybe some of the resistance that we're seeing on the residential side, because obviously a huge push towards residential has gone into social housing and also build to rent, the private rented sector. And the private rented sector similarly is coming up against huge criticism in Ireland, huge pushback on every level. So where you're speaking to investors, how are investors receiving that?
I think they're trying to mollify the whole situation, because as far as they see, it depends what type of product you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a proper lifestyle in capturing BTR scheme, i.e. it's part of the community and it embraces the whole community, and they don't see there's any issues at all, because the fact of the matter is they're providing something for the wider community. Okay, they're making money out of it for sure, but it's at no worse level than it would be if you went for a normal rental, I would say. But in fact, you've probably got more enhanced value with the private rented sector ones than anything else. So I think there's a little bit of, there's also a bit of what I call nimbyism, not in my backyard. They just, the thought of having a BTR scheme in a nice area of Drumcondra doesn't really hold any sway with the locals. But to be honest with you, it's all about density and demographics as well. These schemes are required, you know, and they don't have to be what they're painted out to be. But I think people like to paint them out to demonize them.
You know, I'm really glad that you brought up nimbyism, because it's something that I get criticized for calling out a lot of nimbyism. But there is no doubt that this is rife in Ireland. And in fact, just this morning, you know, only today in the last few hours, we've seen a Marion Road apartment scheme being rejected on appeal. And the interesting one there is that On Board Pleanála actually came out and said the development would depreciate the value of nearby properties. Now, that's an outrageous reason to be pandering to nimbyism, because wherever we put new development, it is going to impact, and people automatically assume the impact is going to be negative, but actually we don't know that. With new population, bringing in diverse populations, you're bringing in the opportunities for new community businesses, new community centres, new initiatives that can actually drive value as well. So it's a very old-fashioned reason to say that more equals worse. And I think it's just, it happens that that one today was Marion Road. You know, similarly, we see that permission for a 99 unit build to rent apartments is being challenged in Beaumont again today. You know, these are, we categorically need more supply right across the board. We need more of everything. So whether we're talking about on the commercial space, the logistics side, whether we're talking about data centres, or whether we're talking about residential for social, affordable, private rental, private for sale. We need more of everything right now. How do we overcome nimbyism? And actually the important question I want to put to you, Vince, is you're dealing with investors outside of Ireland. They're hearing all of this. They're seeing all of these rejections. And for a scheme to be rejected on the basis that it might devalue neighbouring properties, is that something that impacts on the decision making of whether to invest in Ireland or another jurisdiction?
For sure. I mean, I think they would take a very, very dim view of that sort of attitude. Investors want to get stuck in. To be honest, they're very interested in Ireland anyway, because it's got such a great corporation tax rate. I mean, that's let's face facts. That is attractive. And
not that everything has been streamlined across.
It's being streamlined, but it's
national advantage.
I think there's still an advantage at the moment. There's certain rules that are in place that will give an advantage, but that's just one facet. The other facet is you've got a fairly stable population and something that you can pin your hat on. I also think they consider that they can increase the value over time on the assets that are being bought in Ireland. So and that's been proven by past performance as well. But as you're saying, if there's negative trends, they're just not going to invest. There's other places in the EU to invest in, and they'll just switch their funds. Well, I should say at this juncture as well, Cal, one of the big things that everybody's talking about, but it's actually part of the checklist for investors, is the green building ticket. So, and it's not just a nice to have, it's a got to have with a lot of them, which is the other facet that quite a lot of the things, particularly Amber Planola sort of like miss the boat on, is this is what people are looking for, and it's got longevity. Because what you have to appreciate is these investors are looking for the long term. They're not looking for 10 years, they're looking for 25, 30 years plus, right? And they need to make sure that everything's sustainable in it. So it has to be that sort of high level grade stuff, and that particularly on the residential, and they'll create it if necessary. They'll drive that by appointing the right sort of builders, the right sort of materials, etc. But that's another thrust that is misunderstood again in the marketplace. A lot of people just see it as cost, right? Rather than for sure there's an initial cost, but what you've got to factor in is a repayment period and where we're going to in the future. So I think mistakenly some people think that having something that's a bit older and a bit cheaper is going to be good for the future. That might be for a certain amount of investors, but not for the mainstream.
Yeah, I think actually the whole movement around ESG investing, in my mind, certainly I agree with you. A couple of years ago, it was always seen as a cost impediment. Can we afford to do it? Now, actually, you just can't access certain funding if you don't tick these boxes. But in the marketplace, I'm still seeing an element of box ticking. And one of the big sources of frustration for me is around, ESG is the environmental, social governance. And yet all of the focus is on sustainability and the environmental. And actually, I think that if we were to focus on not just the governance, but particularly the social element, I think that would actually it would open up a broader conversation around placemaking that would help people to understand and welcome the benefits of our asset classes like build to rent and other. I think that we haven't put enough focus on social and governance, but particularly on social. And certainly the last 24 months, all of the drivers have been around sustainability. And the reality is, we know that actually the community are looking for sustainability as well, and not just the residential community, your commercial teams, your corporate teams. So even around offices, we know that there's a huge amount of work there, and there's a huge benefit to be unlocked in engaging with the commercial occupiers of business parks and business districts. That hasn't been done in Ireland yet. I'm reading so many exciting and inspiring examples from outside of Ireland. I'm not seeing that done very well anywhere in Ireland. Am I?
No, I sometimes, and forgive me if I sometimes think there's like a return to normality, and that normality is a normality of 10, 15 years ago, rather than a normality of what today needs to be. So I think the dialogue isn't happening really, Carol. They just return to the business parks, etc. Don't think outside the box on a lot of the issues. And I think there needs to be more, to be honest, to be fair, I'm not being unduly critical. I think there needs to be more lateral thinking with a lot of these people. There's no reason why you can't have a properly sourced, affordable housing mixed use scheme altogether with lifestyle enhancements that serves the whole community. I think one of the words that you miss actually is community. If you have a look where some of the business parks are, it's just literally in the middle of nowhere. There's no sense of community. I think thinking about where you have businesses located should be where people are living as well. You know,
Yeah.
It's
I think that's a really important one. Actually, I was down in West Clare this weekend, and I had to drive to find the office of a charity that's involved in tree planting and things like this. And actually, when I used the GPS to find it, it is literally next to the offices of the Cliffs of Moher, and there's, you know, maybe 10 or 12 what look like lockups in this park in the middle of the country. So you're driving past farms, down laneways, past farms to get to it. And actually, that's something that a couple of years ago I might have been critical of, where it's actually, I can see that this is a great way to let industry thrive within the heart of the community. And it was a really interesting setup, not one you come across, but you know, I think it's a great point you're making around community and where we're centering businesses, but it almost leads back to a point you made at the start of the interview here, where you talked about people are talking about going back to the office. We're not really doing it yet. And because of that, investors are taking a bit of a back seat and taking a wait and see approach. We're hearing about this mass resignation. I mean, I don't know. I haven't seen any of the stats on that. So everything we know at the moment is pretty anecdotal around that. But we do know that people's attitudes have changed. How they want to live and work has changed.
For sure. And I think actually, Carol, I think it'll change for the better in some ways, because there's certain organizations that are already thinking to be appealing to everybody. So you're going to have the hybrid worker, you're going to have the worker from home, and you're going to have the full-time office-based worker. And there's certain companies that have already designed their projects and their commercial space to have each of those criteria, and each, obviously not the working from home, but certainly the capability for hot desk for those people should they want to come into the office, etc. So what is very commonly referred to as flexible working space. Now, I can see a lot of commercial developers sort of making their offering more tuned into that, because there's more value to be extracted from that because you've got it strated. But it'll be interesting to see how that's going to pan out, because nobody's thinking like that. A lot of people are thinking, oh, we need to build a 10-floor block of commercial offices and on 15-year leases like we've always done. And to be honest, that's not going to happen. People are just not into signing for a 15-year lease on an office space. These things are changing rapidly. What you're finding maybe is that you'll find people will sign up to renewable 2-year leases and things like that, where they'll have a shorter term lease, but they're more likely to stay for the longer term.
But how are building owners and operators going to, you know, there needs to be structural change then on the financing side of it to accommodate?
Absolutely. To organize it, they need to, this might sound strange, but they need to think a bit like a BTR operator, because those guys, what they deal with is a lot of short-term rentals, a lot of cash churn, because they get paid weekly, monthly. You can structure the whole finance setup to be more like that at the base level, and then at the longer term at the more traditional level. But you need to be fully aware of how your cash is playing out throughout the life of the asset. So what I'm going to say is that you're going to get quite a lot of income generation from a scheme like that. The yields should push up as well, you know, become better for the investor, over time. So it's about, it is change. It's about understanding the marketplace that you're in. It's understanding your cash flows, and it's understanding your tenants and their requirements. That's key understanding what people want in the first place.
Yeah.
You need to understand the marketplace you're in, not the marketplace that you want it to be.
You know, but I think it's really important to point out here is that actually I'm not sure consumers of these spaces know exactly what they want and what their teams want yet. I think that's still unfolding. It's still evolving. It's a little bit like if we were having this conversation 18 months ago, everybody was loving everyone was loving working from home. And then you know, 12 months ago, people were getting pretty sick of that.
Yeah.
Trying to come back to the office. And then another 18 months, you know, after lockdown, we were seeing that people start to settle into a routine. So actually, I still think it's too early for teams to know these requirements.
Yeah, Carol, I agree with you. It is too early to know. But all I'm saying is that I think you have to be a bit of a, you have to think forward, because that's why I'm saying if you've got a flexible office based solution, you're going to be more attractive to more people. So don't cut off any of your suppliers, what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually that brings us to something really interesting, some really interesting CPDs that you're delivering through the SCSI in Ireland right now, repurposing asset classes. That's a really hot topic at the moment, given the level of vacancy and dereliction and everything.
That's right.
How does that work?
Well, essentially what's happening is if you've got some old commercial properties or whatever, even retail properties, and they're not performing, and for whatever reason they're not performing, a lot of people are looking to repurpose those as predominantly residential. It's quite interesting to note this is a European-wide thing. It's not just limited to Ireland or the UK. It's very much because commercial operations, and particularly in city centres and localities, are becoming unattractive. maybe the thing, maybe harsh. And also the retail sector has been decimated in terms of, well, certainly not just COVID, but over time, I think that more and more people have been turning towards the online offerings, and so the traditional retail outlets probably not, following the market, I would say. So all I'm saying is that investors themselves are looking to push their funds that they've got in commercial and retail into new asset classes. If they have an opportunity to repurpose any of those assets as new assets, they're going to take it. Quite a lot of the Irish planning laws are very favourable to change of use. So particularly if you're changing it to residential, there's going to be a limited amount of resistance to a lot of that in various places. So I think that's on the cards. I would also say that they're very interested in doing any of the things we talked about before, data centres, logistics, all that sort of thing. So if they've got a retail park that they convert into a logistics park, happy days. That's what they'll do, because there's more value there. But one document I would say was very, very interesting to read is the Urban Land Institute and the PricewaterhouseCoopers Emerging Trends in Real Estate. They produce this every year, and the 2022 edition is very, very persuasive in what is happening in people's mindset in repurposing assets. I think it's not being talked about, it's being done. And if you have a look on the list of what's in the top 10, it's predominantly residential and what would be considered to be more alternative. One thing you'd think would be the most sensible thing to invest in retirement living, so that's in the top 10 because the population is getting older and hanging around for longer, and it's to provide that assisted living as well. So there's a whole load of factors that people are looking for longevity of income producing assets.
Actually, we never talk about retail enough on this show, and only in the last couple of days I read a Forbes article about how Gen Z is driving growth in new shopping formats, but that retailers, either they're not listening or they don't know how to adapt to these changing needs. But it's really interesting to see how consumer trends are jumping ahead of the offering. And these are not necessarily traditional offerings. These are some of the more experiential and some of the more forward-thinking offerings. Yeah. Yet they just can't keep pace with how quickly consumers' attention and demands are changing. So I think it's a really important one. I'll definitely include in the podcast information here, I will include a list to that report you referenced. I haven't read it myself, So, but it sounds interesting. The ULI,
it's really good. It's very much an international flavour, Carol. Really.
So I suppose in terms of the CPDs that you were offering, what was the main takeaway, say, for, and again, I know you're looking at the European perspective, but say for the Irish marketplace, I mean, are we looking at doing this on large scale or kind of small scale? Are we looking at targeting space over shops and that kind of vacancy, or is it all large scale at the moment?
I think it may be large scale initially, but it might, because I think there's always a place for your bespoke bijou retail outlet and the village outlet, if you know what I mean. It's a community service rather than a retail outlet, if you know what I mean. So there's a different type of status there, but certainly one of the things I would say about Ireland as well, in terms of the investment, it's like you've got German investors and French investors leaning heavily into the marketplace and wanting to extract value. So they might be really looking to get some of these assets for next to nothing to convert them.
Have we made that, has Ireland made that attractive enough for overseas investors?
Sorry, would you mind just repeating that?
No, I'm just, because we need to attract overseas investment to be able to repurpose these assets as well. Has Ireland done enough to make that attractive?
I think it has, because just I was reading the other day about a survey of who's investing in Ireland, and I was a bit taken aback. I was quite surprised that there was it's becoming very, very investable for a variety of reasons. I think the fact that they can pick up some of the assets in the first place. In Europe, there's a big fight going for any particular asset coming up for grabs. In Ireland, if you can identify the asset, you can pretty much secure it, because a lot of these funds have the weight of the money without the competition in investing in it. So it makes it very attractive.
But how important then are our policy regimes, and even the certainty of our policy regimes, because so much has been in flux over the last 3 to 4 years?
Well, that's true. I agree with that, but I think the stuff they tend to invest in is pretty solid and future-proof from their perspective. So what you'll see is a massive surge of investment into BTR schemes, into student accommodation, and they will start investing into the repurposed vehicles if they see they've always got an eye for a bargain, you see. So
yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah.
Okay. Vincent, thank you so much for joining us today and taking us through that. Again, these are conversations that are really just unfolding, and I hope we'll be able to touch base again in another few months just to talk about this and to see which of those trends are really moving forward and which the investment community is getting behind. So for now, thank you so much for joining us. That was Vince Harney, CEO of Anasorian, and we need to take a quick break. Stay tuned.